Socialism. We all know it, and to some extent, we all love it. Isn't that right, fellow reactionary counter-revolutionaries? I am fairly certain that just behind capitalism, socialism is one of the most ridiculed ideas and ideologies on the planet. The criticisms range widely depending on what you personally believe in. Libertarians and those who generally advocate for and support free market economics will focus on the economic sides of socialism and how the nanny state they envision is not just unrealistic, but stupid. Then those who consider themselves nationalists may dislike the internationalism it advocates for. And then there are those who simply aren't fans of the concept of class struggle and may prefer class collaboration and unity. All in all, various different criticisms, but most of these guys would still agree on one basic statement, that whenever socialism was attempted in one way, shape or form, it never really went as well as advertised. Of course, some forms worked better than others and depending on the region, but still it never really gave birth to this supposed equal society with no exploitation. This is particularly and strongly the case of communism. Now stop me if you've heard this one before. That wasn't real socialism/communism, or socialism/communism has never been truly tried. These are responses I think the majority of us have at some point heard in their lives. Now, to be fair, I haven't actually seen that many of them using this one all too often in the year of our Lord 25. Instead, they just move on to straight apologia. Hey, props to them for taking this brave step. But when this form of argumentation was kinda popular, many people have rightly pointed out how absolutely absurd it is. It was basically just a shield to excuse all the things that have gone wrong and all the mass graves filled up with innocent people by previous socialist regimes, and to claim that what they were doing wasn't the real form of their ideology, so we have to try again. This video will not be about debunking this train of logic, since this is a horse that has been beaten to death so hard by anti-communist critics that the horse resurrected just to file a restraining order. Rather, I want you guys to think outside the box a moment here. Isn't that kinda admirable? You have an ideology that has such a well-documented horrific track record to the point that not even Saul Goodman could save it in court, and yet, despite all of that, and all the examples and evidence proving that socialism doesn't work, it's still kicking. Socialism is still very much alive, and if we go by the logic of the marketplace of ideas, that bad ideas will just die out with sufficient public discourse, it is kinda impressive, isn't it? Every time socialists get knocked down, they stand right back up and say, "I didn't hear no bell," and the ideology fights to live another day. Even if you are anti-communist, you have to at least respect that dedication. Think of all the other ideologies in history that weren't nearly as bad, and yet they are now 6 feet under with no real political power, but yet communism, one of the most destructive ideologies of all time, is still around. So in this video, I want to explore that exact topic in detail. We will analyze what is keeping communism and socialism alive and kicking, and from that we will extract the formula behind what makes an idea or ideology so long-lasting and durable, and finally, how we in the right wing could apply that same formula to our own ideas and ideologies, so that we too, whenever we get knocked down, we can just as easily stand up and take even more punches. The key is finding out what exactly keeps an ideology or idea alive for such a long time, regardless if it has a positive or negative track record. Is it just straight up delusions and mental illness? Not exactly. This is a very fascinating subject. So buckle up and let's all go together through the tunnel of learning from our enemies. Speaking of learning from our enemies, we live in a time where you don't just get different opinions from the news, you get entirely different realities. One side calls it a bombshell, the other won't even mention it, and the truth usually buried somewhere in between. That's exactly why I use Ground News, a website and app that aggregates news from across the political spectrum. It's the one tool I actually trust to cut through the noise and show me what's really going on. I've been using it for a while now, and honestly, it completely changed the way I look at headlines. Take this story. Recently declassified FBI documents revealed that the Bureau suppressed evidence of Chinese interference in the 2020 election. That should be huge news, right? If we look at the headlines, Newsweek shows the story relating to the FBI as a whole. Fox News, on the other hand, frames it as a cover-up to protect the ex-FBI director. The crazy thing is, 86% of the sources covering it lean right. There's almost complete silence from the left. That's not balanced journalism. That's more like an echo chamber. With Ground News, you see the bias breakdown, who's covering what, and how headlines are framed across the spectrum. It helps you spot manipulation and understand the bigger picture. So if you're tired of being trapped in algorithm bubbles and just want the facts laid out clearly, go to ground.news/Lavader. You can also find the link in the description or by scanning this QR code, and with it you'll get unlimited access at 40% off their Vantage plan. It's a great deal, and more importantly, it gives you back control over what you read and what you believe. Again, that's ground.news/Lavader. Check it out, and thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Funnily enough, there is actually one man who has actually laid out the formula that we seek, all the way back in the 19th century, and I am surprised that not many people have picked up on it. The man I am talking about is none other than the one man credited with inspiring fascism, the French syndicalist thinker, Georges Sorel. Sorel is an interesting figure to look into. He was not your classical and normal Marxist. He was considered a heretic due to many of his other ideas, namely syndicalism. His most important work is his collection of essays titled Reflections on Violence, and in there is where we will find the answer that we are looking for. Now, as the title suggests, Sorel talks about the essence and ideas behind violence. For Sorel, violence was not just destruction, it had a purpose in history. It acted as a way to restore order and served as an emotional release for societies, whether cultural, religious, military, or political. It wasn't simply about bloodshed for its own sake, but rather about giving sacred meaning to the guiding myths of mass movements and nations. But his opinion on violence is not what we're gonna be focusing on here. Keep in mind that Sorel lived through 19th century France, and this had an enormous impact on his writings and opinions, because, as we know, France during that time was not the most stable politically speaking. Liberalism was being attacked from two sides. On one side was the Catholic Church, which was strict and unwilling to compromise. On the other side was the growing power of the state, shown by the past anti-clerical laws and a return to harsh revolutionary ideas. Sorel obviously rejected both of these. He didn't see either as a valid path forward, but this pushed him to think more deeply about a simple topic: how institutions are created, how they function, and, most importantly, what keeps them going. That thinking eventually led him to his theory of myths, or, as it is sometimes called, the Sorelian myth. During his time, Sorel preached and prophesied what he called the General Strike. What was the General Strike? It was a kind of end-of-the-world vision, a massive revolutionary moment when the day would come that the workers would rally together and end capitalism for good. The streets would run red with the blood of the parasitic exploiters, and power will finally be back where it belonged, in the hands of the workers and the people. Stuff like that. Sorel's idea of the General Strike wasn't too different from what Marx had envisioned. But here is what differentiated Sorel from other Marxists. Sorel preached the General Strike, but he didn't believe in it. By believe, I am saying that he very well knew that this grand day where workers will finally overthrow capitalism would probably never come. Rather, for him, the whole point of this grand story was about giving the people a sense of victory and telling them that in the end they will win, so that the rebellious spirit never fades. And this is what the Sorelian myth is all about. Sorel believed that these myths, like the general strike, were the true starting points of institutions. Myths gave these institutions a power that more intellectual or rational theories simply could not explain. For him, there was more to life than what rational thinking could explain. Imagine a soldier sacrificing himself for his country, bleeding out on the battlefield in an effort to stop the enemy from advancing even an inch. This is something that doesn't make sense through reason alone. When we ask what he died for, people will answer that he died for his country and people. Or, in other words, he died for a myth. Sorel believed that what matters most about a myth isn't whether it's true, but how it affects people. What the myth predicts and whether it is something realistic or unrealistic, it does not matter, because that's not what myths are for. Their value isn't in the details. In fact, what they describe might never happen at all. What counts is the power of the whole idea to inspire action. He said that we should judge myths based on how they push people to act right now. Trying to figure out whether the myth will literally come true, again, misses the point. The whole myth is what matters, not its pieces, except for how they help express the central message. I will now quote the man himself on this. In a letter to one of his close friends, Sorel clarifies his position. Throughout this study, one thing kept coming to my mind so clearly that I didn't even feel the need to say it outright. Whenever people are involved in a big social movement, they always imagine their struggle as a battle that will end in their victory. These imagined victories are what I call myths. Examples of such myths include the syndicalist idea of a general strike and Marx's vision of a massive revolutionary collapse. Other examples come from early Christianity, the Reformation, political revolutions, and followers of Mazzini. What I want to show is that we shouldn't try to break down these mythic images into little pieces like we do with other things. We have to look at them as a whole, as historical forces. Most importantly, we shouldn't compare these imagined futures to what actually happened after people took action. When I used the word myth, I thought I was being clever. It helped me avoid debates with people who wanted to break down the idea of a general strike and prove it couldn't work. In essence, Sorel basically did the meme.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Now you might say that all of this sounds awful like striving for utopias, that Sorel's idea is exactly that which led to so much destruction and death. But I would actually argue otherwise, because again, these myths aren't about describing reality, they express the will to act. A utopia, on the other hand, is a theory created by intellectuals who study the world and design an ideal model of society, judging current conditions by how well they match that model. A utopia is like a blueprint. It has parts that can be changed, and some of these parts might even be used in real things like laws. Myths, however, push people toward revolution. They want to tear down the current system. Utopias tend to focus on fixing or improving it. You can't refute a myth the way you can refute a utopia. A myth reflects a group's core beliefs and is tied to action. It speaks in movement, not theory, and can't be broken into pieces or analyzed historically. A utopia can be taken apart, studied, and compared to real history. You can argue against it by showing that, for example, its imagined economic system doesn't match how the world actually works. Myths like Sorel's general strike is for that reason left intentionally vague in regards to what happens afterwards, because again, the point of the myth of the general strike isn't telling the workers how the world should or would look like, but just that there will come a day when they will win, and that thus drives them towards that goal. What happens after the victory, that will all be seen in due time. An example of a very successful myth that still persists to this day, according to Sorel, is religion. Sorel, in that part I quoted, brought up early Christianity, and in that early Christianity we find a complete and powerful version of pessimism. Humans are born into slavery, Satan rules the world, and only through baptism can Christians hope to be saved and eventually resurrected through the Eucharist. They waited for Christ's second coming, which would destroy Satan and lead believers to heavenly Jerusalem. At that time, Christian life revolved around being part of a holy army always under threat from Satan's forces. This belief inspired bravery, bold preaching, and led to major moral progress. Now, did the second coming of Christ actually happen as they thought? I mean, look around yourself. But again, just this myth that Christ would soon come back inspired early Christians to do all of these things. And this kind of attitude even existed during Sorel's times. In fact, here I will quote him directly where he brings up Catholicism as a strong example. One more powerful example is Catholicism. No matter how hard things got, Catholics never gave up because they always imagined their history as a battle between Satan and the Church, which they believed was backed by Christ. Every problem was seen as part of a bigger fight that would end with their victory. In the early 1800s, when Catholics were persecuted, this struggle with Satan myth came back and inspired writers like Joseph de Maistre. This return of myth explains why religion made a bit of a comeback then. Today, Catholicism seems weaker partly because the myth of the fighting church is fading. Religious writing helped make it seem silly, like in 1872 when a Belgian writer said exorcism should be brought back to fight off revolutionaries. The peaceful, skeptical attitude of today's society makes it hard for that myth to survive, and enemies of the church loudly say they don't want to go back to the old days of persecution and holy wars. And this exact thing that Sorel observed all the way back in the 19th century we can see very well today. The number of young people becoming religious and converting to Christianity isn't because they experienced some kind of spiritual awakening, but as Sorel described, this struggle with Satan myth came back in full force. On one side you have mass immigration, which threatens to demographically replace the Christian population, and on the other you have assaults on religion from the more secular and liberal aspects of society trying to undermine and poison the faith. If this doesn't look like an assault by Satan to, from the perspective of the Christians, destroy the one true church, then I don't know what does. This kind of rise in religious fervor was barely seen in 20th century Europe because everything was peaceful and fine. Religions like Christianity operate most effectively and thrive in oppressive environments. When you have relative peace with no enemy threatening the church, its influence and fervor begins to get weaker and weaker. But the moment this threat emerges, the faith becomes much stronger. For that reason, Sorel naturally concluded that one will never be able to wipe out not only Christianity, but also other Abrahamic faiths like Islam. As long as there are those they perceive as enemies and Satan, the myth will never fade away, and thus the religion will also as a consequence not go extinct, because just like in his vision of the general strike, it tells its adherents that no matter what, they will win in the end. But not all religions, or myths, were built this way. Take Nordic paganism, for example. It was, in many ways, the complete opposite of Christianity. For the Norse, victory was a sign of favor from the gods, especially Odin, and defeat was a sign that they had been abandoned. Their faith was not rooted in a guaranteed final triumph, but in a conditional and transactional relationship with the divine. As long as they won in battle and expanded their territory, they believed the gods smiled upon them. But when those victories dried up, when their people were conquered, converted, and politically broken, they interpreted it as a curse, a withdrawal of Odin's blessing, and so the myth collapsed. There was no deeper promise of eventual redemption, no eternal enemy to struggle against, no vision of final glory that transcended immediate outcomes. Once the myth was broken by reality, it could not be rebuilt. That's the crucial difference, because myths like Christianity and Islam offer salvation regardless of how dark things get, but the Norse myth, like many others that died, only made sense when things were going well, and that is why it didn't survive. This is the formula that I have been talking about. Sorel plainly in his work lays it all out for us. The Sorelian myth. Not a prediction nor a policy proposal, it is a vision so total, so emotionally compelling that it shapes not just thought, but action. It's the kind of story people don't merely believe, but live out. The myth of the general strike, like the myth of Christ's return or also the founding of Rome, gives its believers a destiny. It bypasses logic, reaches into the soul, and says, fight endure, sacrifice, for one day you will triumph. It is a lie in form, but a truth in function. That is what keeps it alive. It isn't about when or whether the final victory will come, it's about the certainty that it must. A people moved by myth will persist longer, fight harder, and recover faster than those merely guided by facts, figures, and rationality. And if we try to apply the Sorelian myth the way modern-day socialists think and act, so many things will start making sense. Communists and many other socialists have the specific belief that capitalism will, at some point in time, collapse. It's not a question of if, not even when, but that it is its destiny. The myth of capitalism's collapse, as believed by many communists and socialists, is the idea that capitalism, by its very nature, carries the seeds of its own destruction. It constantly expands production, exploits labor, and concentrates wealth in fewer hands, but this very process creates deeper inequality, economic crises, and social unrest. Over time, the system becomes more unstable as the working class grows larger and more aware of its exploitation. Eventually, the contradictions between the rich and poor, between production and consumption, and between capital and labor reach a breaking point. The system begins to implode, either through repeated crises or a major breakdown, and the organized working class rises up to overthrow it, replacing it with socialism. This is not seen. Again, it is destiny. So, it is that exact same thing. It tells its believers that in the end they will win and that socialism is inevitable, so they do not have to fear failure. But most interestingly, the myth didn't remain static. If it was left alone like that, as Marx and Engels predicted, it would have died out, because everyone can see that since the 19th century, living standards have only gotten better and goods cheaper. But what later theorists did was they expanded their theory to explain all of this, and thus still keep the myth of the inevitable collapse of capitalism alive. Vladimir Lenin, for instance, in his work Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, introduces a narrative that would later evolve into what modern socialists call the imperial core. According to this idea, the reason why living standards were improving in Western capitalist nations wasn't because capitalism was working, but because it had found a new way to hide its rot by exporting exploitation. Rather than squeezing their own domestic workers, capitalist powers began outsourcing labor to poorer, weaker nations, extracting wealth abroad and bringing it back home. The workers in the core nations were then quote-unquote bribed with higher wages, welfare programs, and consumer comforts, all paid for by the suffering of foreign laborers. This is what some have called the labor aristocracy. But Lenin didn't stop there. He framed this as evidence of capitalism's decay. The bourgeoisie, he argued, were so terrified of revolt at home that they were buying off the proletariat with blood-soaked luxuries from abroad. It's honestly brilliant. They didn't just defend their myth from what looked like a contradiction, they turned that contradiction into further proof that the myth was true all along. In that sense, socialists and communists achieved something remarkable. They didn't just preserve their myth, they perfected it. No matter the condition they found themselves in, they could interpret it as further validation. If capitalism was thriving, they would say, look how desperate it is to distract the workers with shiny trinkets, collapse must be near. If capitalism was in crisis, they declare, aha, another crack in the foundation, we're getting closer to the end. It didn't matter whether things were good or bad, everything became fuel. That is what makes their myth so powerful. It is unfalsifiable. It lives and breathes in all conditions. In a way, it even solves the problem Sorel pointed out about the myth of the fighting church, that religious myth thrives under pressure, in persecution when Christendom is under siege, but it falters in peacetime when there is no clear enemy to struggle against. Communism's myth of inevitable capitalist collapse doesn't suffer from that weakness. It doesn't just survive both peace and crisis, it thrives on both. That, in my view, is the ultimate myth. So, to finally answer the question, why do socialists and communists never give up despite everything their ideas have led to? Simple, because they are not following a plan, they are following a myth. Myths are not judged by what they build, but by what they promise. The myth says that history has a direction, and it ends with the righteous standing over the ruins of the old world. No amount of failure changes that, because as Sorel described, the purpose of the myth is not to describe the world, but to drive people to act within it. It is about conviction, it is about struggle, and the sacred belief that one day, against all odds, they will win. That's why their ideology survives famine, collapse, and death, not despite these things, but because of them. Every disaster becomes part of the myth scripture. Each failure is rewritten as a necessary trial, each corpse a martyr, each collapse a sign that the end is near. The worse things get, the more proof they see that they are on the right path. The myth does not demand measurable success, it only demands continued motion. It feeds off crisis, it absorbs defeat, and speaks always in the language of destiny. The believer does not need results. They need only the feeling that they are part of a great and final struggle. That's the strength of myth. It is invulnerable to the very failures that would destroy a theory or a program, because myths cannot be falsified, they can only be believed in. But here's the irony in all of this. The only time they ever truly faltered was when they succeeded, basically suffering from success. The myth worked too well, and when they finally seized power, when the inevitable victory became real, they were no longer operating in the realm of myth, but of utopia, and utopias can be disproven. They require teeny tiny things like, functioning systems, rational policies, and working economies. The myth had carried them into power, but it could not tell them how to rule. Suddenly, they needed blueprints, laws, agriculture plans, food supply chains, and when those failed, as they often did, the myth had to be patched and twisted to explain away reality. The revolution that was supposed to redeem the world now had to govern it, and that is where the myth, forced to become a utopia, began to collapse under its own weight. That was the why and how. But now we come to the part where we ask ourselves, what can we, in the right wing, learn from this? The answer is simple but difficult. We need a myth, not a manifesto, not a list of demands, but a story, one that is immune to data and circumstance, one that breathes meaning into struggle and offers purpose whether we win or lose, a myth that tells us we are part of something eternal, something that will triumph not because it is well designed, but because it is righteous. We've had myths before, again, Christianity's tale of the church under siege and the fight against Satan, but these myths only function when a clear enemy is at the gate. They thrive under persecution, but falter when the world turns quiet. What we need is something stronger, something permanent, a myth that outlives conditions, one that doesn't rely on crisis to feel alive. But the most important lesson is this: we must not make the same mistake the Socialists did. The myth can carry us to victory, but it cannot teach us how to rule. Sorel said that very explicitly. At some point, myth must give way to governance. That is the threshold that communists failed to cross. They confused their myth for a model. They thought the story that led them to power could also sustain them in power. It couldn't. A myth inspires action, yes, but it cannot calculate crop yields or manage currencies. So we must be careful. We need a myth, but we must know where the myth ends and where policy must begin. The myth must be written, not obeyed, because if we let it ride us, we will fall, and it will trample our blueprints under its hooves. That is far easier said than done, but if we are to survive success, we must learn to master what brought us to it. In any case, for true victory, we need a myth, but we also must learn how to ride it properly. And it also matters what kind of myth we choose. Not every myth has to be a grand apocalyptic prophecy about collapse and rebirth. Some can be more grounded and more cunning. Look at Donald Trump and his MAGA movement. He built a myth too, the idea of a corrupt elite, a deep state plotting in the shadows, and a forgotten people rising to reclaim their nation. It was anything but rational, but it was powerful, and for that reason he transformed the American political landscape forever. It gave his supporters a sense of destiny, of battle, and of moral clarity. And it worked. That kind of myth, tailored to the moment yet untethered from results, can be just as effective. So whether it is built from blood and soil, sacred tradition, or national betrayal, the right must craft a myth that endures, one that fuels us through loss, steadies us in victory, and never allows us to forget that the true danger is not in having no myth, but in letting it consume us. I won't pretend to have that myth in my pocket or in this video. All I have to offer is, ironically, a kind of blueprint for finding one. History is crowded with successful models. Rome's legend of the wolf-reared twins who would build an eternal city, the American myth of manifest destiny that drove wagons west until it reached the Pacific, and the concept of the American dream, Zionism's story of an exiled people sworn to return to their ancient homeland. Each of these tales was ridiculous on paper, but irresistible in practice, because they wrapped ordinary politics in the armor of destiny. Our task is to craft a narrative of equal voltage, one that outlives elections, market cycles, and the rise and fall of individual leaders. When we finally forge it, we must ride it without letting it ride us, wield it without letting it blind us, and remember that a myth is a flame. Handled well, it lights the future. Mishandled, it burns the world. Thanks to all the glorious people on Patreon who are supporting me in these endeavors. Special thanks to Mudkips Our Life and SOAV for their extremely generous and high pledges. That really helps me out a lot. Anyway, bye bye!